The Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. Thank you.
Hi there, and welcome to Baseball by Design. I am SportsLogos.net minor league baseball correspondent Paul Caputo, broadcasting live, as always, from the Sunday Helmet Hall of Fame in my basement in Fort Collins, Colorado. This is going to be a really fun episode. I'm going to be speaking with Tess DeMeyer, who is the staff editor at the news desk at The Athletic. And you might know Tess's name from an amazing article that she wrote for The Athletic that was then picked up by the New York Times, which owns The Athletic, about minor league baseball logos and branding. So I wanted to have Tess on and speak about that article and just Tess's perspective on what she learned about minor league baseball logos and branding, which of course is the subject matter of this podcast. After that long introduction, Tess, good morning. How are you doing?
Good morning. Hello. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. And this is the second time that we have gotten to speak. The first time you called me and we chatted for a little while, and you were gracious enough to include a couple of quotes from me in your article, which was quite a thrill for me. That was really fun. I am curious to know, like I said, I wanted to have you on because you are a serious journalist writing on what can be described as a silly subject, and we talked about that a little bit beforehand, but minor league baseball logos and branding, serious business, kind of a silly subject matter. I'm curious to know, sort of going into writing that article, what was the baseline? How much did you already know about minor league baseball and branding, and what was the learning curve as you went into that article?
Honestly, I knew next to nothing. I just knew every couple months I would see a new team pop up on Twitter and go viral with their cute little mascot and their funny hashtag or whatever. And I think I mentioned this during our first interview, but I very ignorantly thought like, oh, this is a marketing play. This is a gimmick. All these teams are just doing this to sell t-shirts. So going in, that's what I was trying to figure out. Like, are they just doing it to sell hats to all 50 states?
So the article first appeared on May 20. When the Athletic tweeted it out, they said the magic lies in the quirks that tie minor league baseball clubs to a community. And so, like you were saying, you thought it was sort of commercial, and they were doing it to sell t-shirts. I can tell you that the teams don't mind selling t-shirts, and it probably would not continue if it were not lucrative. But what did you learn about these minor league teams that extended beyond the branding just being a marketing ploy?
This is something that you and your listeners probably already know. So they're like, you're preaching to the choir, girl. We're aware. But most of, if not all of these teams, their names, their mascots, their branding, their colors have a story behind them that connect to the community, whether it's local industries or history or landmarks, popular figures, historical figures, recent pop culture figures. That's where the names come from. And there's a story behind most of them, if not all of them.
How did you take this story to your editors? How did it come up that The Athletic wanted to have this article about minor league baseball logos and branding?
I'm so glad you asked this question because this go round, when it got published for real this time, I pitched it to one of our MLB editors in late February or March, but I had been thinking about this story for a year or so before, and I had brought it up with someone else within The Athletic. And the reason I backed off and didn't do it initially is because I found your podcast and I didn't want to like step on your toes. It was like, oh, he's already doing it. Like, I don't want to rip off his coverage, his content. And then the second time around, the Dairy Daddies exploded on Twitter. That's what kind of spurred me to think about it again. And when I brought it up with my editor this year, he was like, well, why don't you just find the podcast guy and include him in the story? I was like, you know what? That's a good idea. I should track down the podcast guy and see if he'll talk to me.
That is funny. Well, I'm very happy to be the podcast guy. And I can tell you, from my perspective, it was thrilling to see this subject matter that we care about so much in this community in a high profile media like The Athletic, and then to see it get picked up by the New York Times. How are those decisions made? What, I was, you texted me one morning and you said, "Hey, look it," and it was, and my parents actually subscribed to the New York Times, so they had the printed copy of it, which I now have. How did it come to pass that this article, went from The Athletic online to the New York Times in print?
That's so awesome. I'm glad you got the print copy. I also love to pick up a print copy whenever I happen to have a byline in the newspaper. Honestly, I'm not sure. We have a team, people from The Athletic, people from the New York Times. I know we can pitch stories to the Times like, "Hey, we think your audience will enjoy this. What do you guys think?" For me, it's usually a surprise when something I've written ends up in the printed version of the Times. I've been told, I don't know the basis of this, but I've been told that New York Times readers really like baseball. So I was hopeful when I did this story. I was like, it's quirky, it's kind of off the beaten path. Seems like something their readers would like. But like you were saying earlier, it published on the 20th, May 20th,
Hmm.
online, I think,
Hmm.
and got good play online. Our design team did really cool graphic for the top, and a lot of the social promo material was very cool and colorful. But then it didn't initially appear in print, so I was like, "Oh, I got passed over, that's okay." But then on the 29th, that's when the full big spread showed up in print kind of out of nowhere, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, look."
Yeah, that was quite a thrill for me. It was, to see my name in the New York Times is a little bit wild, right? From this little passion project of a podcast. I'm
It's
curious. I
cool,
mean,
right? It's
it
never
was,
not cool.
yeah, it's very cool, right? Like there's no denying that, and it was fun to share that around on social media. And like when I first learned that you and I were going to speak, it was actually April Fool's Day, and I texted my family and I was like, "Hey, I'm going to be interviewed for The Athletic." And there was some sort of chatter back and forth about it, and my sister-in-law Jody was finally the one who put it out there. She said, "Does this feel like an April Fool's joke to anybody?" And so when the article actually appeared, I think was the first time anyone really believed that you and I were having these conversations. The article obviously featured a number of quotes from a number of folks in the minor league baseball industry. Was it a surprise to you, sort of how deep you ended up going in terms of who you talked to, like folks from teams, designers, that sort of thing?
Yes, I was genuinely very shocked at how enthusiastic and available everyone was to talk to me. I just reached out to a ton of different teams. I have a spreadsheet with a whole list of team names of everyone I reached out to, thinking a few would get back to me. And like all of them got back to me immediately wanting to talk that day. So I was like, whoa, I ended up with so much information. And honestly, the hardest part of writing the story was editing, having to cut some things out because it was
Mhm.
just too long.
Yeah,
And there's so much good stuff in there that was just left on the cutting room floor. Fortunately, thank you, New York Times designers who made the spread. A lot of the teams got kind of featured in the art of the print spread, which was very cool
right.
because I to, express gratitude for them taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah.
But it was overwhelming in the best way possible. But also a little shocking in that going back to the beginning, like I said, I didn't know too much about minor league branding before this.
Hmm.
I thought the people behind the team names and designs and branding were like guys in suits who ran focus groups and were very stuffy. So to then talk to all these teams and find out that their front offices are a couple people who are
Yeah.
just being creative and coming up with puns because they also think it's silly and fun was a ton of fun. And then talking to Dan Simon, who is not a man in a suit either. Just
No.
fascinating, great guy.
Yes. Well, Dan obviously is a regular contributor to this podcast, and he'll be on. He is on every single episode with what we call a Studio Simon Stumper, which is a trivia question that he brings. So I'll be curious to see, what sort of stumper he has for me for this episode. But that, for me, my background's in graphic design, and that is part of what got me into this podcast. And I always sort of joke that my three main loves are graphic design, baseball, and ice cream. And so, that's how I got into doing a podcast and collecting these little ice cream helmets. The designers who you got to speak to, and I know that you said that the Dairy Daddies logo was one that really prompted you to go over the finish line to write this article. So you spoke with Dan, you spoke with Jason Klein from Brandios. I know there were a couple of other designers who were quoted in there. Was there something specific that you gleaned from speaking with designers from, from the big firms who do this work?
I don't want to use the word shocked because that implies that I didn't think they were doing the legwork, but genuinely I was shocked at the amount of research they did before creating the mascots. I mean, really delving into the community, the food, the people before either pitching ideas to the teams or working with the teams on the ideas they had already brought to the table to really bring something that the community would embrace. If not immediately, then would learn to love.
Hmm.
And also, this was a whole section that I'm sad got cut from the story because I thought it was fascinating. The color palette, like the decisions behind a color palette. And, sometimes it's, oh, we need two base colors and a zing color, as Brandios calls it, like a sea foam green or a hot pink or a coral or something, which I get. But
Hmm.
sometimes colors are also like tied into the story.
Hmm.
This is why we chose this specific shade. I just thought that was really interesting. But unfortunately, did not make the word count at the end. That's okay.
Well, that's how come you're here now, is to talk about those things that didn't, the limitations of print are a little more severe than they are here in this podcast format. Was there anything else? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but was there anything else that you wish had made it into the article that did not?
Oh, just more stories of teams unveiling their new brand for the first time. Like the biscuits, I'm sure you've heard this story. It was told to me kind of secondhand because the man who I spoke to with the biscuits, he wasn't there when they officially unveiled, but he said it was done at some festival and the team went up on stage and was like, "We're the biscuits." And then it was just silence, like no response. Uh,
The
yeah.
Biscuits are a team that I point to as being one of the very first that started this arc of wacky minor league baseball logos, right? Like that was, I always say 2004. I hope I'm right on that, but it was early to mid 2000s that the Biscuits were unveiled. And it was one of the first like overtly silly minor league baseball logos. And it started us down this path. One of the questions that I get a lot, and I'm going to turn it back on you, is where does this end, right? Because I think that the people saw the Dairy Daddies as being especially outrageous or especially silly. And I got the question a couple of times about that logo, like, is this it? Like, is this as far as it goes? So I'm curious to know from you, what sense did you get from the teams that you spoke to or the designers who you spoke to? Is this escalation going to continue? Do you think that we're going to be, back here in 5 years talking about, wow, I can't believe that new logo was just unveiled? Or do you think we've reached the crescendo?
I could see it continuing, even if it's just with alternate identities,
Mm,
because every team I talk to is cooking up some sort of silly, wacky, unexpected alternate identity, which was another thing. Unfortunately, I didn't have the word count to dedicate a whole section to,
yeah.
but that's how I could see it escalating further, I guess, more than the everyday identity.
Hmm.
Because I don't know who could. I have, now that I've been thinking about this, just from doing this story, I'm like, I could come up with some good minor league team names, but I don't know if I have anything that outdoes the Dairy Daddies in terms of shock value, I
Right,
guess.
right. Do you remember when before the Dairy Daddies and you were thinking about doing this article? Obviously, there were some team names that had caught your name or that you had seen out there. Do you remember which ones besides the Dairy Daddies were the ones that you thought, oh, this would be a fun story to cover?
The Trash Pandas,
Oh yeah,
the
that one
main one.
comes up all the time in conversations. I was so after this article was published, I don't think I told you this. After this article was published, the sports radio station 670 The Score in Chicago, they saw the article and they reached out to me and they said, "Hey, would you come be a guest on our weekend, sports show and talk about minor league baseball logos?" And Trash Pandas was the one that they pointed to as catching their eye, and that's such a specific story. And I've told it before on this podcast where they sold $4 million worth of gear before they had even played a game because they unveiled in 2019 for the 2020 season, which was then canceled, and then by the time they took the field in 2021, they had sold gear basically everywhere. It's interesting to me that that logo is one that catches people's eyes. What was it about it that you what do you remember about it that you liked what was it that differentiates that one from some of the other ones that are out there?
Think the name Trash Panda, it
Yeah.
started, they lashed onto that as their name around the time when more people started using that term to be silly. I guess I had seen it on social media referring to raccoons as trash pandas.
Hmm.
And their mascot is cute. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna lie. He's not very intimidating, but I think he's cute. And he's a raccoon astronaut, which means he's probably went to a lot of school for that. Maybe he's an engineer. Like that's pretty impressive.
I think he's definitely an engineer. And the episode of this podcast that we did on the Rocket City Trash Pandas, we had from the Marshall Space Flight Center, we had Jay Hollenbeck, who works with NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center and is in charge of the like, let's get people back to the moon in 2025 program. And then when I visited Alabama in 2023, just last year, we visited him. He went to a game with us. He took us all around the Marshall Space Flight Center and like showed us all the work that NASA is doing. And we talked to Jay about could NASA get a raccoon in a trash can into outer space? And his feeling was probably not, but even if we did, getting it back would be a problem. So, but yeah, like that's their explanation, right? Like that raccoons are clever and engineers are clever, and we have lots of engineers in Madison, Alabama because NASA is here. And so those like you say, those stories are so much fun and those connections are pretty great. And the reason this podcast exists, are there other? I'm not going to ask you your favorite. This is one of my peccadillos about doing this. Is I constantly get the question, which one's your favorite? And I don't have a favorite. There's just too many of them. But are there others that either in the process of writing this article or before you wrote the article, others that caught your eye, ones that you noticed out there?
I mean, definitely the Savannah Bananas because
Oh yeah.
I'm from Savannah.
All right.
So I think the first baseball game, professional baseball game I ever went to was a Sand Gnats game.
It's a classic.
Yeah, before they left.
Yeah.
I can't remember where they went. You would know better than
They're
I
the
do.
Columbia Fireflies now.
Which I like better than the Sand Gnats. Fireflies are way
Yes.
more fun than Sand Gnats.
I think in general people like fireflies more than they like sand gnats. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Um, so the transition from Sand Gnats to Bananas, I remember that being a big uproar in the Savannah area.
Yeah.
But the Bananas were so popular from the jump, even before they kind of switched to being the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball, I guess, when they
Yeah.
were playing true competitive baseball. So the
Yes.
Bananas definitely, and all the fun stuff they do with their uniforms.
Yeah.
And their first mascot, like the muscly banana guy who would come out with sunglasses on. I would see that all over my social media.
Oh yeah.
There's so many fun name teams that I just kept adding and adding and doing more calls. And it got to a point where I was like, I need to stop interviewing and actually write the story. Um, we already talked about the Biscuits, but I especially love the Biscuits mascot because of the way his eyes are. He kind of looks like a Sesame Street Muppet.
Yeah.
He looks like Elmo. Um, I thought Hot Tots was so cute and
Oh
clever.
yeah.
Sod Poodles, that's just fun to say.
It is.
And I didn't know what a sod poodle was. Also, I thought getting into that call, looking at their primary logo, which is kind of like half of the sod poodle's face with his hat on,
Yeah.
I thought he looked like a camel.
Oh yeah,
So
that's interesting.
Tony from the sod poodles was not, I wouldn't use the word offended, but he was like, huh, haven't heard that one before.
I think that touches on the fact that it's like visually minor league baseball. It's a very distinctive aesthetic. It's a lot more sort of like whimsical and fun and cartoony, and like you mentioned, the sod poodles, right? Like a, a cartoon prairie dog, right? Like is, and I could see how you could look at that and like if you're only seeing part of the animal, it looks, a little bit like a different animal. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, but I think it highlights the fact that there's a different aesthetic visually and a different approach to sports branding. Like I think most sports branding is meant to be side or either cool or kind of intimidating. And minor league baseball is very much not that. Was there sort of a common theme when you talked to teams about why that was, about why sports branding in minor league baseball would be so different from other sports?
Oh, definitely. A lot of the teams spoke about how the initial pushback they got revolved around this isn't intimidating enough, this isn't fierce, this isn't good for a sports team for that reason. Their response was, yes, we're a sports team, but also we're family entertainment. We're providing affordable entertainment for everyone. We're bringing in new fans. And that's what our mascots and branding do. They catch the attention of people who may not already be baseball fans and get them into the ballpark. And then they realize, hey, this is fun. I want to come back. I want to buy the merch, which then gets more people in the conversation.
You are hitting on something that I have been meaning to ask you and sort of building up to this whole time, which is what did writing this article inspire in you in terms of did you buy yourself any merchandise from teams? Have you gone to any minor league baseball games this season? What have you changed at all since writing this article?
I have. I went to a Blue Wahoos game in
Awesome.
Pensacola, Florida. My boyfriend lives there. He's in flight school to be a pilot. So when I went to visit him for Memorial Day weekend, we went to a baseball game, which admittedly, growing up, I was not a huge baseball fan. My family, we're college football. So I would watch the men's college World Series, the women's college World Series on TV, but I didn't go to Braves games until I was an intern at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and they sent me to cover the game.
Yeah.
So I never really kept up with baseball. But after doing this story, I've had people text me, I'm gonna buy you Trash Pandas gear. Like my friends are like, I'm gonna get you this and this and this. And I'm going back to Pensacola for 4th of July, and I've already looked at the Blue Wahoo schedule, and I'm pretty sure I need to check again, but I'm pretty sure the Biscuits are in town. So I'm like, should I try to go back to see the Biscuits? Also, I got a picture with the Blue Wahoo's mascot. His name is Kazoo.
This is a very slippery slope that you're on right now, and I absolutely love it. I think that's amazing. Listeners of this podcast will want to send you ice cream helmets, just so you know.
I love ice cream.
Yeah, unfortunately, when they send the helmets in the mail, they don't come with the actual ice cream. So
That's it.
at the Blue Wahoo's game, first of all, that's so far as I understand, a really beautiful stadium. I have not been there before, but I've seen photos of it, and it's right on the water, and it has a pretty amazing view. And so that, if I were to add to my list of things that I love, the ocean is very much one of them. And so to be right on the Gulf like that with the Blue Wahoos, I would love to see that ballpark. What do you remember in terms of like the between inning activities? What about, the minor league baseball experience that now has you looking at their schedule and other teams' schedules and thinking about how do I get to more games? What did you experience there at that game that resonated with you?
Yeah, I think the first thing I noticed was their jerseys. It was a pink day for some reason,
Hmm.
and they had on pink jerseys that had flowers on them that kind of looked like SpongeBob flowers, if you know what I'm talking
I
about.
do. Yes.
Um, and I happened to be wearing a pink shirt that day, which was
Thematic.
yes. I was like, oh, good. I match with all the other local fans here. And then toward the end of the game, I think it was like after the 6th inning, they had a roach run
Oh no.
where no, it's not as bad as it sounds. I'm assuming someone, maybe they didn't force, maybe someone in their front office volunteered to dress up as a roach and they let them run across the outfield and then released a bunch of children to chase this roach. And the kids just got to run like from one side of the field to the other.
That is amazing. Did you get any hats, any t-shirts, helmet Sundays? Yeah.
I got a hot dog, which is
Mm,
my favorite baseball food. As much
nice.
as I love ice cream, when I go to a baseball game, my association is with hot dogs, which is
Yeah.
unfortunate because you don't get something to take home like you would with a baseball.
There should be a little plastic hot dog dish that has the team logo on it.
Yeah,
You could collect those. No merchandise. You didn't get it like a hat or a t-shirt.
I didn't. Maybe
Okay.
next time. There's a
All right.
couple minor league teams who I just love the mascot so much that
Yeah.
I would buy it simply for that, which is what I thought people were doing when I started this story. So, now I've become what I
Well, you see all of the hats on the wall behind me. There are 480 ice cream helmets on the shelf out in the basement out here, and so yeah, what you're saying will sound familiar to minor league baseball fans who listen to this. Tess, before I let you go, just in general, I wanted to circle back to the article because, I mean, for me, yes, it was a thrill to be quoted in the article, but it was also a thrill to see this thing that I care about a lot, minor league baseball branding, get national attention. I know that there was also an article in the Wall Street Journal that, delved into the same subject matter. Do you have a theory? Do you have an opinion on why now, in regards to what is it about minor league baseball that's capturing the public's attention, even if they're not sports fans? Which, by the way, is sort of the market for this podcast, right? Like, I don't talk about statistics or players or standings or anything like that. I talk about the stories that these logos tell. So you can listen to this podcast and not be a fan of baseball. So I'm curious to know, as a journalist who covered this subject matter that is sort of near and dear to my heart, what did you learn? What are your main takeaways, and why do you think, it's capturing the public's attention now? I realize those are big questions.
I First of all, let me say I'm not an expert the way that you are to be answering these big questions, but I will do my best. I think there's a couple factors. One, social media playing such a huge role. People who wouldn't have these logos and team names in front of them before are now getting them kind of served up to them on TikTok, on Twitter, the way that I did, because I wasn't necessarily seeking out baseball content when I saw the Trash Pandas and the Dairy Daddies. Also, with how affordable they are, it seems a lot of teams really are committed to making sure families of four can come to the ballpark, get tickets, food, get ice cream with their kids, whereas professional baseball games and sometimes even college, I mean, I'm thinking of college football specifically, the
Sure.
tickets sometimes are like outrageously expensive, and
Yeah.
that's something that you could do every weekend. You're lucky if you can do it once or twice a season.
Right.
I think those are two big factors. And then those people tell more people how much fun it was, and the team seemed to be making a great effort to be involved in their communities and increase their own visibility. And you see someone like the Blue Wahoo's Kazoo standing at the grocery store waving and bagging groceries, and you're like, what is that? I want to go, and it's only $15 for a ticket. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm down.
It's almost more interesting for me, like, I mean, like you say, I deal in this subject matter a lot, and so it's very interesting for me to hear your perspective as someone who was assigned or self-assigned the task of researching this thing that, like I say, is near and dear to my heart. So I appreciate that you did that for the world. I love that it got out there the way it did. I love that it got picked up by the New York Times. I do plan on getting that article, framed and up on my wall. So your work will be immortalized here in the Sunday Helmet Hall of Fame.
I feel so honored.
Yeah, well, it was an honor for me, but so Tess, again, thank you so much for covering this subject matter and for including me and for taking the time to come speak to me for an episode of Baseball by Design. It's been so much fun to chat with you about this.
Thank you. I've had a blast.
Well, I hope that we see more minor league baseball coverage in the Athletic, and obviously reach out anytime. As you know, I'm happy to talk about this subject matter. In the meantime, Tess, where can people find you and your work?
You can find my work, my articles at nytimes.com/athletic. That is the homepage of The Athletic, where if I write anything, it will appear there. And you can follow me on Twitter at Tess_DeMeyer.
Okay, and that will be in the show notes. Tess, thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon.
Yes, thank you.
All right, everyone, welcome back. It is time once again for Studio Simon Stumpers with designer extraordinaire and my good friend, Dan Simon. Dan, good morning. How are you doing?
I am fantastic, Paul Caputo. How are you?
I'm doing very well. This was such a thrill for me to have been interviewed by Tess DeMeyer and to be included in this article that was in The Athletic and then picked up by the New York Times, the actual print edition of a newspaper, which is an amazing thing these days. You, of course, were also included in that article, and I dare say that it was your Dairy Daddies brand that you created for the Danville Dairy Daddies that has inspired this sort of flood of media coverage that has been going on with this with minor league baseball. I feel like there's been a handful of articles now in prominent news outlets about minor league baseball. And I think that I just feel like when I have been contacted by reporters about this, they bring up the Dairy Daddies right away. They're like, wow, the Dairy Daddies sort of changed things. And I know you're not going to like be the person who sings your own praises here, but do you agree with that assessment? And when you were working on that Dairy Daddies brand, did you know that you were working on something a little bit different?
So there's two questions there. The answer to the first one is, do I agree with that assessment? And the answer to that is yes, that does indeed seem to be the case. And I might even go so far as to say that is indeed the case. It's not just it seems to be. For whatever reason, that identity just had an impact on it made a bigger wave than even some of the more popular brand identities that I've done, just because of frankly, because of the nature of the visual, the name of the team and the character that is the focal point of that identity. To quote my one of my clients, Alicia Amling, a friend of the podcast.
Absolutely, former guest.
She's part of Temerity Baseball, the ownership group that owns the Kannapolis Cannonballers, the Greensboro Grasshoppers, and the Lexington Legends. She loved the identity, and she says, to paraphrase her, she says, why am I so taken with this semi-lecherous cow? So it's that it's a we've seen you use the word wacky, crazy, fun brand identities, both names and the visual accompaniments for them. We've seen plenty of that in minor league baseball. This one went a little further.
Yeah.
Further. For you listeners, Paul and I have this thing. It's more me asking him. I very much value Paul's opinion on grammar and the written words because Paul is a journalist. As the minor league baseball correspondent for sportslogos.net, as well as the author of a book that was originally the stories that ran on sportslogos.net, the stories behind the nickname. So, and you were, I was going to ask if you were a journalism major. You weren't. You were a French major, right?
I was a French major with a journalism minor, but mostly I am just pedantic and, love love grammar and usage, and am the sort of person who will care about whether it's further or farther or champing at the bit or chomping at the bit, regardless of whether people actually understand, like whether there's a need for those distinctions or not. I try to be more descriptive than prescriptive, but I don't always succeed at that. And our conversations about further versus farther are certainly uh, part of that. Dan, I do have a question for you before we get into the stumper for today's episode on the interview with Tess here. You have been interviewed more than I have for these articles that have appeared. What has your experience been in sort of bringing along folks who have not been along for this several decade ride of the changes in minor league baseball? When these journalists come to you and they're noticing a world that we've been a part of, you've been part of it longer than I have, but certainly that is something that we've become sort of entrenched in. And then these reporters come to you and it's relatively new to them. What has that experience been for you to try to sort of bring them along into this world? Is it possible to fully introduce someone who is new to minor league baseball logos and nicknames?
Being that I think you used the word entrenched there, and that's a very good word for that. Being that I have been so entrenched in the world of minor league baseball brand identity development for the past now 30 plus years, I'm always surprised when I'm contacted by someone and they're only really just like learning about minor league baseball brand identities as kind of this thing. And I shouldn't be surprised, but for me, it's just so much a part of my life that it's like, you haven't noticed this before, but the reality is, depending on where people are, there's not always a minor league team near them.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate in that, well, at least here in Louisville, I've got a minor league team right down the street, so to speak, 5 to 6 miles down the street from where I live. When I lived in Los Angeles, though, I had to drive. I'm trying to think of where the closest minor league team was, probably the Lancaster Jethawks,
Hmm.
which was, I think, like a 45-minute drive, but I also would go to the Rancho Cucamonga Quakes, which was about 60 miles. The Lake Elsinore Storm, I think that was about 90 miles. The High Desert Mavericks, again, 90 or 100 miles. I drive that far just to go to a minor league game, but not everyone has one right there. So, and if it's not right there and not part of your community, it's just not in your world, you're not going to be familiar with it. You're going to be familiar with major league teams, even if you don't have one in your city, just because of the exposure they get on national TV that minor league baseball just doesn't get. So as far as bringing them into the world, I love talking about graphic design. I love talking about baseball, and I love talking about the two intersecting. And so it's frankly just a joy for me to have people wanting to talk about it. So I don't know if I can, in one conversation, like bring them up to speed with where you and I are at, being that, this is, you have a podcast built around it. I have a business built around it. But we could certainly tell them all about, the fun and that it is, as well as, when I'm interviewed, a lot of times they want to know some of the specific stuff, like how does it work? How do you build a brand identity? Where does it start? How do you do it and all? And sometimes that's kind of hard for me to explain because I don't even know if I know how I do what I do. I really think this is not hyperbole. There's sort of a magic in there. It's just, it's not a magic trick. It's magic to me that I do these things and they resonate with people the way they do. I'm not saying I'm a magician and I'm amazing. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying it amazes me the reactions that these things get. And it's like, how did I do that?
Well, I will say, as someone with a background in graphic design, but certainly not illustration, I feel like there certainly is magic. It does. I've said on this podcast before, it feels a little bit like wizardry to me because, my background in graphic design is with, page layout and composition and, signage and that sort of thing. And it's all stuff that has rules that you can follow. And I know that there are rules to logo design, and there are best practices, but I can point to when I create something, if I create a layout for a magazine or a book or something, I can point to, here are the rules. This is the grid that I'm using. This is, the point size and the leading and all that sort of thing. And if someone, challenges me on something, I can say, okay, well, here's why it is the way it is. And I think with logo design, someone can challenge you on something, or worse, they can just be like, meh. And you can't point to a rule and be like, no, you have to like it because. And so, you have to create something that is visually appealing while also sort of following all of these rules and constraints, when it comes to things like how a logo is going to look when it's embroidered, how it's going to look when it's digital, and all those sort of things. So, Dan, you know that I could talk about this forever and ever and ever. And here we are 10 minutes into this segment and we haven't yet brought up today's studio Simon Stumper. So let's do that. Let's get to the purpose of this segment, the studio Simon Stumper. What do you got for us this week, Dan?
Okay, well, this episode featured Tess DeMeyer of The Athletic.
Right.
The Athletic was founded in 2016, purchased by the New York Times in 2022. So it's not been around as long as some other sports. I'm going to call it a publication, even though I'm not sure not sure if there is a physical publication, but at the very least, it's a digital publication. But in that very short time, it's become a fairly well-regarded sports publication. And, it's for its stories, interviews, coverage, analysis. They even have podcasts. I listen to the Athletic Baseball podcast. But it's only been around a short time. But I think in that short time, it's up there with some of the venerable sports publications like Sports Illustrated. So our studio assignment stumper today we're going to talk about Sports Illustrated.
Okay.
Now, the very first issue of Sports Illustrated was published on August 16th, 1954. So we are about to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Sports Illustrated. But we're going to go back to that August 16th, 1954 issue. And our studio assignment stumper today asks, what sport was featured on the cover of that first issue? Was it A, the sport that is the subject of this podcast, baseball, B, pheasant hunting, or C, steeplechase horse racing?
Okay, I'm going to eliminate baseball right away because I remember, I feel like I remember that it was not a major sport, that it was, everyone sort of looks at it and says like, oh, look how different the whole notion of Sports Illustrated was. And Sports Illustrated, I know you said we're about to commemorate their 70th anniversary, but it's a shadow of what it once was. It's all sort of AI generated. They fired their whole staff, and Sports Illustrated is not what it used to be, sadly. So that is it is sad to think about what Sports Illustrated has become. I am not stalling here, but I did just want to make that comment as a journalist. So the other two choices were pheasant hunting or steeplechase. And I want to say I'm pretty sure that it was, well, I'm not pretty sure, but I want to say that it was pheasant hunting because I feel like I remember that it was, something like sports as in sportsman, right? Like hunting was a thing that sportsmen did in the 50s, and that's sort of what Sports Illustrated started as. It was less like coverage of the major sports and more sort of about being a sports person in the world. So I don't think steeplechase. I do think pheasant hunting. I'm not super confident. The only thing I'm super confident of is that it was not baseball.
Okay, well, in that case, you couldn't be more wrong. So
I saw you laughing as I said that.
Pheasant hunting, and in the first couple of years of Sports Illustrated, pheasant hunting and steeplechase horse racing were indeed on the cover of Sports Illustrated, as were bullfighting, dog shows, badminton, mountain climbing, hot air ballooning, bird watching, and skin diving. But on the very first issue of Sports Illustrated on August 16th, 1954, it featured baseball, specifically Milwaukee Braves third baseman and future Hall of Famer Eddie Matthews at bat, with New York Giants catcher Wes Westrom behind the plate and umpire Augie Donatelli behind Wes Westrom. So that was the first issue. Now, here's a few interesting things about that cover. First of all, there was no story on Eddie Matthews or the Braves in the issue.
Oh.
It was on the cover, but there was no story about it. Eddie Matthews happens to be the only player to play for all three iterations of the Braves, the Boston Braves, the Milwaukee Braves, and the Atlanta Braves. Only one player, and that's Eddie Matthews. And here's another thing you might find interesting. Wes Westrom, the catcher for the New York Giants on that cover, who also became later a major league manager, I believe, also for the Giants. His middle name is Noreen. What's up with that?
That is an interesting question. Must be a family name, huh?
Family of, like, his mom's name was that Noreen. I've never heard, I've got a really good friend, a guy whose first name is Lauren, Loren, but I've heard that as a first name for men, even though it's also a first name for women.
Right.
But I've never heard of man with the middle name Noreen, but Wes Westrom.
Well, I Googled this first ever cover, and you're right. I could not be more wrong. So this stumper is like, when your team goes out there and loses 12-1, and you just say, well, it's only one loss in the loss column there. It's you can only lose by so much, and it doesn't matter. So I'll take my lump. I'll move on to the next episode. And man, I sure thought that Sports Illustrated, that it was like hunting or something. As soon as you asked the question, I was just like, oh, this is hunting or something. So
Well, like I said, there was a lot of those non-major league sports, like outdoors type things, on the cover of Sports Illustrated for at least the first several years. And I even remember I had a subscription to Sports Illustrated growing up, and I remember, the Westminster Dog Show seemingly every year would get a cover, like the dog that won it each year would be on the cover. So every now and then there would be some non-major league sports featured on the cover, but certainly, basketball, baseball, hockey, football, those types of things, boxing, there's a lot of boxing, were usual. But in the early days, you'd have pheasant hunting,
okay.
So.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. This has been fun. Obviously, you remain not on Twitter, but on Instagram at studio_Simon and online at studiosimon.net. Thank you very much for this fun stumper. It was indeed a fun one. And we'll see you next week.
See you then.